On December 30th, 1947, Romania's King Michael got a phone call. He was at Palace Castle in the mountains, planning to spend New Year's there with his family. The voice on the other end was Romania's Prime Minister, Petru Groza. There was a meeting in Bucharest. Michael needed to come back. Today. When Michael arrived at Elisabeta Palace a few hours later, the building was surrounded by soldiers loyal to the communist government. Inside, Groza and two senior communist officials were sitting at a table with a document already typed and ready to sign. It was Michael's abdication. Groza explained the situation plainly. Sign the document, or 1,000 Romanian students currently in communist custody would be executed by morning. Michael refused. Then Groza reached down and showed Michael's mother, Queen Elena, who was standing in the same room, the pistol on his belt. Michael signed. By that evening, Romania had been declared a People's Republic. 43 years of the Romanian monarchy, 2 world wars, a generation of kings, and a royal family that traced its lineage back through half a dozen European dynasties, all of it ended in an afternoon, in a room surrounded by soldiers, because a 26-year-old king looked at his mother and decided that a country was not worth the price Groza was asking him to pay. Michael was given 24 hours to leave. What happened to him over the next 7 decades, the exile that followed, the years of working as a pilot and a stockbroker and, briefly, a chicken farmer, the moment in 1992 when over 1 million Romanians came out into the streets just to see him again, and the 5 years that followed when the government panicked and banned him from coming back, is a story that sits somewhere between tragedy and something harder to name. It starts not in 1947, but much earlier, with a boy who became king at the age of 5, got pushed off his throne by his own father, then got it back at 19 under a fascist dictator who treated him as furniture, and then at 22 did something that historians argue shortened the Second World War by weeks, possibly months, and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Romania in 1927 was not a country that expected much from its monarchy. The kingdom had existed for less than 60 years in its modern form. King Ferdinand, who had ruled since 1914, died that July, and the throne passed not to his son Carol, but to Carol's own son, because Carol had already made the decision to renounce his place in the succession and leave Romania with his mistress, a woman named Elena Lupescu, whom the royal court found deeply unsuitable and whom Carol found worth giving up a kingdom for. That left a 5-year-old boy named Michael sitting on a throne that was, practically speaking, not his to sit on. A regency council ran the country in his name, consisting of his grandfather's brother, Prince Nicolae, the patriarch of the Romanian Orthodox Church, and the Chief Justice of the Court of Cassation. 3 men, none of them elected, none of them Michael, making every actual decision while a small child existed as the formal head of a state he could not yet read the documents of. He was king for 3 years. In 1930, his father changed his mind. Carol II, living in exile with Lupescu and apparently having reconsidered the trade-off between love and a kingdom, flew back to Romania, landed at Bucharest's Băneasa airport, and within days had maneuvered himself back onto the throne he'd previously given up, with the Romanian parliament voting to lift his renunciation and restore his royal rights. Michael, now 8 years old, was demoted from king to crown prince and sent back to being a child whose father was, by most accounts of the period, not especially interested in him. Carol II spent the 1930s accumulating power and accumulating enemies in roughly equal measure. He was not without intelligence or political instinct. He was also vain, erratic, and increasingly authoritarian, dissolving political parties, taking a mistress whose influence over government appointments became an open scandal, and moving Romania progressively closer to Germany as the decade wore on, and the threat from Nazi Germany made neutrality look increasingly expensive. By 1938, Carol had suspended the constitution, abolished political parties, and declared a royal dictatorship. By 1940, after Romania had been forced to cede territory to the Soviet Union, Hungary, and Bulgaria in rapid succession, the country was in a state of political collapse, and the military and fascist movements that had been building throughout the decade finally had enough. In September 1940, Carol II abdicated under military pressure and fled the country with Lupescu. He took with him an enormous quantity of the Romanian royal treasury, a collection of artworks, and several railcars worth of personal property that he had managed to load onto trains before anyone could stop him. Romania's new strongman, Marshal Ion Antonescu, let him go rather than deal with the complications of keeping him. And Michael, now 19 years old, was king again. This time, though, the throne was not being kept warm by a regency council. It was being run by Antonescu, a career military officer with fascist sympathies and a working relationship with Adolf Hitler, who had no intention of sharing real power with a teenage monarch and made that clear from the beginning. Michael attended ceremonies. He signed documents that were put in front of him. He represented the Romanian state at functions where his presence was required, and Antonescu ran the war, because by 1941, Romania was at war. Antonescu had signed Romania into the Axis and committed Romanian troops to Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Romanian forces fought alongside the Wehrmacht across Ukraine, into the Caucasus, and at Stalingrad, where the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies were largely destroyed in the Soviet counteroffensive of November 1942. Hundreds of thousands of Romanian soldiers died on the Eastern Front, fighting a war that was, by 1943, increasingly obviously lost. Michael watched all of this from inside a palace where his own prime minister treated him as a symbol rather than a ruler. He was not consulted on military decisions. He was not included in the strategic conversations that determined where Romanian soldiers would fight and die. He was, in the words of more than one diplomat who observed the arrangement at the time, a very polite young man who was allowed to live in a palace as long as he didn't cause trouble. He was also, as it turned out, paying closer attention than Antonescu realized. By mid-1944, the situation on the Eastern Front had changed dramatically. The Soviet Iasi-Chisinau offensive, launched on August 20th of that year, broke through Romanian-German lines in Moldavia with devastating speed. Within 3 days, the Axis defensive positions that had held for months were gone. Romanian and German forces in the northeast were encircled. The strategic picture had shifted so completely and so quickly that even Antonescu's most optimistic advisors could see what was coming. Romania was going to be overrun. Antonescu's plan was to keep fighting, negotiate the best possible terms from a position of continued resistance, and hope that the Western Allies might intervene in a way that kept the Soviet Union from taking full control of the country. It was not an entirely irrational plan, but it depended on assumptions about Western priorities that were never going to materialize, and it meant more months of fighting and dying for a cause that was already finished. Michael had a different plan. For months before the Soviet offensive began, Michael had been quietly meeting with opposition politicians, disaffected army officers, and representatives of the underground Romanian Communist Party who had been brought into the conspiracy specifically because they had direct lines to Moscow. The idea was simple in its bones and enormously complicated in its execution. Arrest Antonescu, announce an immediate ceasefire with the Allies, and switch Romania from the German to the Allied side before the country was simply absorbed by the Soviet advance. On August 23, 1944, Michael put the plan into motion. Antonescu was summoned to Elisabeta Palace under the pretext of a routine consultation about the military situation. When he arrived, Michael confronted him directly and demanded that Antonescu immediately authorize an armistice with the Allied powers. Antonescu refused. He argued that the armistice terms being offered were unacceptable, that the Germans would retaliate, that the timing was wrong. Michael said, "If things are so, then there's nothing we can do." That was the signal. A colonel and 4 soldiers who had been waiting in an adjacent room walked in and arrested the Marshal of Romania in the royal palace. That same evening, at 10 o'clock, Michael went on national radio and announced that Antonescu had been deposed, that Romania was immediately ceasing hostilities with the Allied powers, and that a new government was being formed. Romanian troops across the country received orders to stop fighting the Soviets and to turn their weapons against German forces instead. What happened next was militarily significant in a way that is difficult to overstate. The Romanian army, which had been one of the largest Axis forces on the Eastern Front, switched sides in a matter of hours. Romanian soldiers who had been fighting alongside the Wehrmacht began fighting against it. German forces in Romania, suddenly facing hostile troops on 3 sides, were forced into a rapid and chaotic retreat. The Wehrmacht had to divert significant resources to deal with what was now an armed enemy where they had previously had a cooperating ally. Romanian troops spent the remainder of the war fighting on the Allied side, pushing through Transylvania, Hungary, and into Czechoslovakia. Romanian historians and Allied military analysts have estimated that the August 23rd coup shortened the war in Eastern Europe by several weeks at minimum, reducing casualties in the final campaign by numbers in the hundreds of thousands. The Western Allies recognized what Michael had done. The United States awarded him the Legion of Merit. In 1945, Stalin himself authorized the Order of Victory, one of the Soviet Union's highest military decorations, to be awarded to the Romanian king. It was the same Stalin who was, at that exact moment, positioning the Soviet-backed Romanian Communist Party to eventually take Michael's country away from him entirely. Michael was 22 years old. He had been dismissed as a figurehead for most of his reign. He had been told, explicitly and implicitly, by the man actually running his country that his opinion was neither wanted nor relevant, and he had spent months organizing, in complete secrecy, inside a palace full of Antonescu loyalists, a conspiracy that changed the outcome of the war. The Communists would spend the next 4 decades trying to erase his role in it. Official Romanian historiography claimed that the August 23rd coup had been a spontaneous popular uprising led by the Communist Party, with the king reduced to a passive bystander whose contribution the party's documents hardly mentioned. It was a lie, maintained so consistently and for so long that a generation of Romanians grew up not knowing what their king had actually done in 1944. The 3 years between the coup and the abdication are sometimes described as a slow communist takeover, which is technically accurate and emotionally misleading. It was slow only in the sense that it happened over 28 months rather than immediately. In every other sense, it was relentless, systematic, and ultimately inevitable given the single most important geopolitical fact of post-war Romania. The Red Army was there. Soviet troops had entered Romanian territory as part of the Allied advance, and they stayed. Under their physical presence, the Romanian Communist Party, which had had perhaps 1,000 members in 1944 and almost no electoral support among a largely peasant, Orthodox Christian population that had no particular sympathy for Soviet-style politics, began accumulating power through a combination of Soviet backing, political manipulation, and outright intimidation. Democratic political parties found themselves progressively unable to function. Opposition politicians were followed, party offices were searched. Printing presses were shut down on technical pretexts. People who organized too visibly for the National Peasants' Party or the National Liberal Party found themselves questioned by security services that were increasingly controlled by communist appointees. Michael tried to resist within the constraints of a constitutional monarchy that was itself being systematically hollowed out. In 1945, he refused to recognize a communist-backed government that he considered illegally imposed. For 6 weeks, he went on what amounted to a royal work strike, refusing to sign any government documents, hoping that the international visibility of a king openly refusing to countersign his own government's decrees would draw Western attention to what was happening in Romania. The British and Americans took note. The Soviet-backed government survived the 6 weeks unchanged because no amount of Western attention translated into any actual leverage in a country the Red Army was occupying. The show trials came in late 1947. Iuliu Maniu, the leader of the National Peasants' Party and one of the most respected democratic politicians in Romania's history, a man who had served 3 times as prime minister and who had won every genuinely free election he had ever stood in, was arrested, tried in a proceeding that lasted a matter of days, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was 74 years old. He died in prison in 1953. By late 1947, Michael was the last remaining obstacle between the Romanian Communist Party and total control of the country. Everything else had been cleared away. The communists actually gave him permission to travel to London in November 1947 for the wedding of Princess Elizabeth to Prince Philip. The calculation in Bucharest was fairly transparent. They hoped he would simply not come back. It would have been the easiest possible outcome for everyone. Michael could live out his life in comfortable exile. The monarchy would dissolve by default, and nobody would need to make any difficult scenes. Michael didn't stay. He had met Princess Anne of Bourbon-Parma during the London visit and was thinking about an engagement, and he had decided that he wanted to make that announcement from Romania, in his own country, as its king. He returned to Bucharest in November 1947. Winston Churchill had advised him not to go back. Several Allied diplomatic contacts made clear that the situation in Romania had deteriorated past the point where his presence changed anything. Michael went back anyway. 6 weeks later, Groza called him to Elisabeta Palace. Michael left Romania on a train on New Year's Eve, 1947. He crossed into Switzerland with the clothes he had packed in 24 hours and a small collection of personal items. Everything else, the palaces, the estates, the centuries of royal property accumulated across the reigns of his father and grandfather and great-grandfather, was nationalized by the Romanian government within weeks. In 1948, the communist authorities stripped him of his Romanian citizenship entirely. He had been king of Romania. He was now stateless. He went to Greece first, staying with relatives. Then to Italy, to a house near Florence that Anne's family made available. Then to Switzerland, first near Lausanne, then near Versoix, outside Geneva, where he and Anne settled into what would become 45 years of exile in the same country. Anne of Bourbon-Parma he had married in Athens in June 1948, a year after meeting her at the royal wedding in London. It was a marriage that seems to have been genuinely happy across 5 decades and 5 daughters, which is worth noting because it was also a marriage conducted under circumstances that would have tested almost anyone. They were building a household on what they could earn rather than what they had inherited, raising children in a country that was not theirs, in a language that was not their first. Michael's resources in exile were limited. The communist government had taken everything with legal cover. The nationalizations were real government acts, however illegitimate their underlying process, and there was no obvious mechanism for recovering property from a Soviet-aligned state during the Cold War. He had what he had brought out. He had whatever Anne's family could provide. and he had his own ability to work. He trained as a commercial pilot and flew for a time. He worked as a stockbroker for a New York-based brokerage firm operating in Europe. He ran an investment advisory business. He farmed chickens briefly on a property in England during one period when the finances required it. The image of a former European monarch keeping chickens in rural England has a quality that is either darkly comic or quietly dignified, depending on how you choose to read it, and it was genuinely how he spent part of his exile. The geography of those years traces a path that tells its own story. Greece, Italy, England, Switzerland. The European aristocracy in exile had its own geography after the war, a network of houses and borrowed properties and modest apartments where former kings and princes lived out the consequences of wars and revolutions that had remade the continent. Some of them had money, some had connections. Some had nothing except a name and a claim to something that no longer existed. Michael had the name and the claim, and eventually, the job. The decision to work was not just financial necessity, though it was partly that. It was also a way of building a life that was his own, rather than simply waiting for a restoration that might never come. He was very good at the piloting, by all accounts. He had trained during the war, maintained his license through the exile years, and took on real commercial and test pilot work that required genuine competence, not honorary employment manufactured to give a royal exile something to do. The stockbroking and investment advisory work that followed were similarly grounded in actual professional knowledge. He developed a reputation in Geneva's financial circles as someone genuinely knowledgeable, and he brought to his work an understanding of European political dynamics that had some commercial value. A man who had personally navigated the politics of wartime Romania, who had direct experience with how communist takeovers worked and what they meant for property and capital, who knew the major figures in half a dozen European royal families and the governments connected to them, had a particular kind of insight that was useful to people making long-term investment decisions about Eastern European markets. What comes next is the part of this story that even people who know something about Romania's history tend to miss. Romania's communist regime under Nicolae Ceausescu, who took power in 1965 and ran one of the most repressive surveillance states in the entire Soviet bloc, spent real resources keeping track of Michael. The Securitate, Romania's secret police, maintained active files on the exiled king for decades. Romanians who attempted to contact him faced investigation. His mail was monitored through intelligence cooperation with other Eastern Bloc services. The regime officially treated him as a non-entity. Struck from Romanian history books, his role in the 1944 coup attributed to the Communist Party, his name erased from official accounts of the period. And simultaneously they spent significant intelligence resources tracking him. The files documented not just Michael's activities in Switzerland, but a whole network of Romanians in exile whom the Securitate treated as a coordinated monarchist threat. Romanian émigrés in Paris, London, Munich, and New York who had any contact with the royal family found themselves flagged. Romanians inside Romania who sent letters abroad that were opened and photographed before being resealed, letters that mentioned the king's name in anything other than officially approved negative terms, were noted. People who kept a photograph of Michael somewhere in their home, a gesture of private loyalty that cost nothing and changed nothing, were sometimes recorded in Securitate dossiers as potential enemies of the state. The contradiction between the official dismissal and the actual surveillance only resolves when you understand what Ceausescu was actually afraid of. Not Michael specifically, but what Michael represented, the possibility that legitimacy could exist outside the communist state. That there was a version of Romania's history in which the Communist Party's seizure of power was not the inevitable result of historical forces, but a specific act of political violence carried out against a country and a king who had done nothing to deserve it. A man in Switzerland flying cargo planes was not a military threat to the Romanian state. He was a narrative threat, which in Ceausescu's Romania was considerably more dangerous. In December 1989, after 42 years, Romania's communist government collapsed. The revolution was faster and bloodier than most of the Eastern European transitions of that year. Ceausescu had ruled through extreme economic austerity, a personality cult more elaborate than anything else in the Soviet bloc, and a security apparatus that was willing to shoot protesters in the streets. When the shooting started in Timișoara in December and then in Bucharest, the army eventually refused to continue firing on Romanian citizens. The Securitate fought on for days after the regular military had switched sides. By December 25th, Ceausescu and his wife Elena had been captured, tried in a summary military tribunal that lasted about an hour, and executed by firing squad. The whole transition, from the first protest in Timișoara to the death of the dictator, took 16 days. Romania was free for the first time since 1947. Michael flew to Romania on Christmas Day, 1990, exactly 1 year after the revolution, with his family. He had spent 43 years waiting for this moment. He was stopped at the airport and turned back. The new government of Ion Iliescu, a former Communist Party official who had been part of the nomenclatura under Ceausescu before positioning himself as a reform figure, had decided that Michael's return was not in Romania's political interests. The calculation was similar to the one the communist government had made 43 years earlier. A popular former king returning to a country where the political situation was still unstable was a complication nobody in power wanted to manage. Michael was refused entry and flew back to Switzerland. A free Romania had just done to its former king exactly what the communist Romania had done. 2 years later, in 1992, the Iliescu government made a different calculation. They allowed Michael a 3-day visit to Romania for Easter. The decision was almost certainly made with the expectation that Michael would be received warmly but manageably, that his presence would generate some positive coverage, and then he would leave and things would return to normal. Over 1 million people came out to see him in Bucharest alone. A speech Michael gave from the window of his hotel drew crowds that blocked the major streets of the capital. People who had grown up under communism, who had been taught in school that Michael was a minor historical figure whose abdication had been a natural step in Romania's revolutionary progress, came out in numbers that made clear they knew a version of history that had never appeared in any official Romanian textbook. The Iliescu government's response to over 1 million Romanians spontaneously appearing in the streets for their former king was to refuse him another visa for 5 years. He was banned again. Not by the communists this time, but by the elected post-communist government of a country that was theoretically on its way to becoming a democracy. The mechanism was different. The outcome was the same. Michael spent those 5 years continuing to live in Switzerland, continuing to speak about Romania in international forums, and continuing to meet with foreign governments and European institutions about Romania's prospective entry into NATO and the European Union. He made himself useful in ways that were harder to ignore than a man simply existing in exile. He lobbied. He met with officials. He used the connections that came from being a member of Europe's extended royal network to open doors for a Romania that was trying to reorient toward the West. Romania joined NATO in 2004. It joined the European Union in 2007. Michael's contribution to those outcomes cannot be precisely measured, but the Romanian governments that sent him on those advocacy trips clearly believed he was adding something that their official diplomatic channels were not providing as effectively. It was the final strange chapter of a life full of them. A man who had been stripped of his citizenship and his country by the communist government was later recruited by the democratic government that followed it to use his status as a former king to lobby foreign governments on Romania's behalf. The institution that had been abolished was being deployed diplomatically by the republic that had abolished it. In 1996, Iliescu lost the presidential election to Emil Constantinescu. In 1997, the new government restored Michael's Romanian citizenship. He was allowed to return to the country he had left on a train on New Year's Eve, 1947. Properties started coming back too. The Savarsin estate in western Romania. Use of Elisabeta Palace in Bucharest as a family residence. The same building where Groza had shown his mother the gun 50 years earlier. Eventually, after years of legal proceedings, Palace Castle in Sinaia, where Michael had been staying when the phone call came on December 30th, 1947. The restoration was partial and complicated, as all such restorations are. Romania remained a republic. There was no serious political movement to restore the monarchy, and Michael never claimed to want one. He split his time between Switzerland and Romania, attending national ceremonies, meeting with politicians and officials, and functioning in the ambiguous role of a former king in a republic that had decided it respected him without quite knowing what to do with him institutionally. In October 2011, on his 90th birthday, Michael addressed the Romanian parliament. He sat in a chair that some accounts describe as throne-like in its dimensions, and he received a standing ovation from most of the members present. Several government ministers and President Traian Băsescu refused to attend. It was the first time he had spoken to that chamber since before the communists had abolished the institution he'd represented. He had waited 64 years for that room. Queen Mother Elena, Michael's mother, who had been in that room at Elisabeta Palace when Groza showed the pistol, followed her son into exile. She had spent the war years supporting Michael's resistance to the communist takeover, had tried to use her own international connections to draw attention to what was happening in Romania, and had found, as Michael had found, that attention without leverage changed nothing. She spent her exile years largely in Florence, in a modest apartment that was a considerable distance in every sense from the royal residences she had occupied in Bucharest. She died in Lausanne in 1982, 35 years after leaving Romania, without ever returning. Her body was eventually brought back to Romania and reinterred at Curtea de Arges, the royal necropolis, in 2019. Anne of Bourbon-Parma, Michael's wife, died in 2016 in Aubonne, Switzerland, at the age of 94. She had been a princess of a family that had itself spent time in exile, had married a man who had just been stripped of his kingdom and had spent most of her married life in a country that was not hers, building a household and raising 5 daughters in circumstances that required a particular kind of stubborn practicality. She received a state funeral in Romania with full honors, despite never having been crowned, despite never having had an official role in Romanian public life, because by 2016, the Romanian state had decided that the wife of King Michael deserved to be brought home to a country she had spent most of her life unable to visit. Michael himself spent his final years in declining health, having withdrawn from public life in March 2016 after a diagnosis of leukemia and a form of skin cancer. His eldest daughter, Princess Margareta, took over the responsibilities of what the family calls the Romanian royal house, the institutional continuation of a monarchy that legally no longer exists, but that functions as a cultural and historical organization within Romania. The 5 daughters, Margareta, Elena, Irina, Sophie, and Maria, had grown up in Switzerland as citizens of a country that was not their parents' country, speaking French and German and eventually Romanian as a kind of deliberate inheritance, a language kept alive in the household not because they would necessarily ever live in Romania, but because it was theirs and had to remain theirs. Margareta has continued in the role of public face for the royal house since Michael's death, occupying the ambiguous position of a crown princess of a country that has no crown, maintaining an organization that has no official constitutional standing, representing an institution that exists in cultural memory more completely than it does in any legal document. Michael died on December 5, 2017, in Aubonne, Switzerland. He was 96 years old. More than 20,000 Romanians queued at the Royal Palace in Bucharest to see his coffin lying in state. The line stretched for hours. People came from across the country, some having traveled through the night, to pay their respects to a man most of them had never seen in person, whose reign had ended before most of them were born, but whose story they evidently knew in a way that mattered to them. The state funeral on December 16th drew crowned heads from across Europe: Spain's former King Juan Carlos, Sweden's King Carl XVI Gustaf and Queen Sylvia, Britain's Prince Charles, representing Queen Elizabeth II, Greece's former Queen Anne-Marie, the Grand Duke of Luxembourg, Belgium's Princess Astrid. From the Royal Palace in Bucharest, Michael's coffin traveled by train to Curtea de Arges, on the railway line that his great-grandfather King Carol I had built, to the royal necropolis where the kings of Romania had been buried since the 19th century. He was interred alongside his grandfather Ferdinand, who had been king during the First World War, and his father Carol II, the man who had pushed him off a throne at age 8. As the funeral cortege moved through Bucharest, crowds along the streets chanted his name. Romania has not restored its monarchy. Public opinion polling has never produced a sustained majority for a formal restoration, and Michael himself, in his final years, said he had no expectation that it would happen. The Romanian constitution contains structural obstacles to restoration, and the political will that would be required has simply never materialized in the way it materialized, for instance, in Spain when Franco died. What Romanians seemed to want was not the institution, it was this particular man, this particular life, this particular record. They wanted to acknowledge what he had done in 1944, which their own textbooks had spent 40 years misrepresenting. They wanted to say something about the abdication, about what it meant that he had been forced at gunpoint to give up a country and had spent 70 years in Switzerland and never stopped being Romanian. The restoration that happened was not constitutional. It was something quieter and probably more durable. It was a country deciding, 2 or 3 decades after getting rid of the system that had erased him, that the man who had been erased deserved to be remembered accurately. A king who arrested a dictator at 22, forced at gunpoint to sign away his country at 26, who spent 45 years flying cargo and raising daughters in Switzerland and worked as a chicken farmer in England and never stopped lobbying, quietly, for a country that kept telling him to come back later. He got home eventually. He just had to wait 50 years for enough of the people making the decisions to change their minds. If you want to see how that same story played out somewhere else, Greece's King Constantine II lost his throne in a military coup in 1967, spent 47 years in exile in London, and had a relationship with his own government that looked, in certain years, remarkably similar to what Michael went through with Iliescu. That video is next. There's a detail about Carol II's departure from Romania in 1940 that usually gets 1 sentence in the history books, if it gets mentioned at all. When Carol fled with Lupescu under Antonescu's pressure, he had been planning the departure for some time. The train that carried him out of Romania was loaded with items from the royal collection, paintings, furniture, silverware, archival documents, personal jewelry, and a substantial portion of the royal family's liquid financial assets that the departing king had been methodically removing from Romanian state custody in the days before the abdication. Some estimates of the total value run into the tens of millions of dollars by any reasonable calculation of what those assets would be worth today. Carroll spent his exile years in Portugal and later in Brazil, living in relative comfort on what he had managed to take with him. He died in Estoril, Portugal, in 1953, 9 years after the son he had twice displaced from the throne had managed to pull off a coup that saved Romania from the worst consequences of its wartime alignment. He never reconciled with Michael in any meaningful way. He never acknowledged what Michael had accomplished in August 1944. He had spent Michael's childhood treating him as an inconvenient afterthought, and his exile treating him the same way. Michael's own later comments on his father were restrained to the point of diplomatic evasion, which tells you something about the kind of man Michael was, and probably something about what he actually thought. The contrast between the two reigns and the two men is worth sitting with for a moment. Carroll II, given a throne he inherited by birth and the resources of a whole kingdom, used that position primarily to accumulate personal wealth, entrench personal power, and then evacuate both when the situation became dangerous, leaving behind a country he had steered into a catastrophic wartime alliance. Michael, given a throne stripped of real authority and surrounded by people who wanted to use or discard him, used what little he actually had to pull off one of the more significant acts of political courage in the Second World War, and then spent 70 years in exile working for a salary and lobbying for a country that kept refusing to let him back in. The comparison is not exactly subtle, but history is not always subtle, and the Romanian public seems to have understood the comparison clearly by the time Michael died in 2017. The property restitution battles that followed the fall of communism added another layer of complexity to Michael's relationship with post-communist Romania. The nationalizations of 1947 and 1948 had taken everything through government acts that were legally enacted by the Communist Parliament, whatever one thought of the legitimacy of that parliament. The legal question after 1989 was whether those nationalizations had been legitimate acts of a sovereign state, which would have made the properties permanently transferred, or whether they had been acts of political confiscation carried out by an illegitimate regime, which would have created the basis for restitution. Romanian courts worked through this question gradually across more than 2 decades, and the answers were not uniform. Different properties went through different legal processes. Some were returned directly. Others required years of litigation. Several cases went through multiple levels of appeal before being resolved. The Savarsan estate in western Romania was returned in 2000. Peli's castle in Sinaia, where Michael had been staying when Groza's call came on December 30th, 1947, went through a more complicated process involving disputes between the royal family and the Romanian state about the terms of any potential return, eventually resolving in the family's favor after years of legal proceedings. The total value of what was returned and what remained unresolved was never publicly established with any precision. The arrangement that exists represents a pragmatic settlement rather than a full accounting of historical injustice, which is probably the most that could have been expected from a legal system that was itself being rebuilt from scratch after 1989, and that faced property restitution claims from millions of Romanians across every sector of the economy. The extent of the communist surveillance of Michael only became fully known after 1989, when the Securitate archives were partially opened to researchers. The files documented not just Michael's activities in Switzerland, but a whole network of Romanians in exile whom the Securitate treated as a coordinated threat. Romanian émigrés in Paris, London, Munich, and New York who had any contact with the royal family found themselves flagged in the files. Romanians inside Romania who sent letters abroad, letters that were opened and photographed before being resealed, were noted if they mentioned the king's name in anything other than officially approved negative terms. People who kept a photograph of Michael somewhere in their home, a gesture of private loyalty that cost nothing and changed nothing on any political level, were sometimes recorded in Securitate dossiers as potential enemies of the state. The scale of this surveillance reveals something important about how the communist regime actually understood its own position. The more elaborate the official mythology became, the August 23rd coup recast as a communist-led popular uprising, Michael's role erased and replaced with party heroes. The more energy the regime spent maintaining the fiction, and the more obvious it became to any attentive observer that the fiction was fragile. A version of history that was genuinely secure in its legitimacy would not have needed to spend intelligence resources monitoring a man farming chickens in England. The surveillance was the tell. The regime that officially claimed Michael was a historical irrelevance was simultaneously treating him as a live threat. Those two things cannot both be true, and the Romanians who understood their own history knew it. The opening of the Securitate archives after 1989 gave researchers access to documentation of surveillance operations that had been running for over 40 years. The files on Michael and on the Romanian exile community in Western Europe ran to thousands of pages. The intelligence services of multiple Warsaw Pact countries had cooperated in tracking Romanian émigrés, sharing information, flagging contacts. The machinery devoted to monitoring people who had left Romania and who had no capacity for any kind of armed resistance was extensive enough that its budget would have been visible in any accounting of how the communist state spent its resources. What the files also revealed, more indirectly, was that the Securitate had a reasonably accurate picture of what Michael was actually doing during his exile years. Working, raising his family, maintaining his connections to European royal and political networks, advocating for Romania in international contexts when the opportunity arose. There was nothing in the files that constituted a genuine security threat, because there was nothing in Michael's actual activities that constituted a genuine security threat. He was not running an armed movement, he was not organizing a restoration plot, he was flying cargo planes and managing investment accounts and occasionally giving speeches to Romanian émigré communities that the regime characterized as seditious because they stated historical facts the regime had decided were politically inconvenient. The absurdity of that situation was not lost on anyone who read the files carefully. The Romanian state had spent enormous resources for 4 decades monitoring a man who was doing nothing more threatening than telling the truth about what had happened on August 23, 1944. That truth survived the regime that tried to suppress it. It survived Ceausescu, who died in front of a firing squad on Christmas Day 1989. It survived the post-communist governments that tried to manage Michael's return on their own terms. It survived 70 years of exile and was still there, intact, when over 1 million Romanians came out into the streets of Bucharest in 1992 to see the man who had lived it. That's the thing about suppressed historical facts. You can keep them out of the textbooks. You can keep the man who embodies them out of the country, but you cannot keep them out of the conversations that happen at kitchen tables, in whispers, in the stories that grandparents tell grandchildren about what they actually remember, as opposed to what they were told to say they remember. Romania's communists controlled the textbooks for 40 years and still could not control that. Michael knew it. The Securitate knew it. And on a warm spring afternoon in 1992, when 1 million people appeared in the streets of Bucharest for a 3-day visit by a former king most of them had never seen in person, the government of Ion Iliescu found out that it knew it too,